My name is Tyler. I'm 28 years old and I live near a small town in rural Wisconsin. My family has been in the dairy farming business for over 30 years. It isn't a huge farm, but we have a decent-sized herd and we do practically everything ourselves. That weekend, my parents traveled to an agricultural fair in another town, where they usually exhibit some of our animals and buy and sell used equipment. I stayed behind to take care of the property until they returned on Sunday. It wasn't anything new to me. I'd spent plenty of weekends alone there ever since I was a teenager. The routine was always the same: milking early in the morning, feeding the cattle, repairing fences, and doing one last check before going to bed. Our house sat about 80 meters from the main barn, with 2 cattle pens between them and an old shed my grandfather had built decades earlier. At night, the entire area became completely dark. Other than the porch light and a single pole light near the water tank, there was practically no illumination. The nearest neighbors lived almost 2 kilometers away. After 10 at night, it was common for not a single car to pass along the dirt road leading to our driveway. That night, I finished my final round a little before 11:30 p.m. The air was cool, with the steady breeze that occasionally makes the metal siding on old barns pop and creak. I went inside, made myself a sandwich, and sat in the kitchen scrolling through tractor part listings on my phone. I left the back door unlocked because I still planned to head out one more time to check on a cow that was close to calving. While I was looking at my phone, I happened to notice a glow passing across the kitchen window. It wasn't a bright flash, just what looked like the reflection of 2 headlights moving between the trees. It immediately struck me as odd because no vehicle should have been out there at that hour. I walked over to the window and watched. The headlights disappeared almost instantly, as if someone had shut off both the engine and the lights at exactly the same time. I kept staring for a few more seconds and realized the light had come from directly behind the old barn, an area where there wasn't any road, parking spot, or legitimate reason for a truck to be. My first thought was that a driver had simply taken a wrong turn. Even so, something about the situation made me uneasy before I had even decided to go outside and check. I grabbed the small flashlight I always kept near the door but decided not to turn it on. The light would only reveal exactly where I was. I slipped out through the back of the house and walked slowly along the side of the cattle pen. The ground was still damp from the light rain that had fallen earlier that afternoon, so I tried stepping where there was less gravel to avoid making noise. As I got closer to the old barn, I started hearing sounds that didn't belong there. First came quiet voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, only that at least 2 people were speaking calmly, as if they didn't want to be overheard. Then I heard a distinct metallic scraping noise. It sounded like a heavy chain being slowly dragged across a concrete floor. I knew that sound because we used thick chains to secure some of our farm equipment, and it was almost identical. I crouched behind a stack of hay bales covered with a tarp. From there I could make out part of the rear end of a large truck sitting in complete darkness without a single light on. I didn't recognize the vehicle. There wasn't a company logo on it, and no license plate reflected the moonlight. My stomach tightened immediately. None of our suppliers would ever show up unannounced close to midnight, much less hide a truck behind the barn. My first instinct was to go back to the house and call 911. I had no intention of confronting anyone. I started backing away the same way I had come, moving as quietly as possible. When I reached the opening between the cattle pens, I stopped dead in my tracks. Someone was standing there. I couldn't see his face because he remained perfectly still in the darkness, but I could clearly make out the silhouette of a man blocking the path back to the house. He wasn't carrying a flashlight and appeared to be looking directly at me. My heart immediately started pounding. I quietly took 2 steps backward and tried convincing myself it might just be a neighbor, but that made no sense. Then I heard another voice, this one much closer, coming from the opposite direction behind the barn. A second later, I heard another one off to my right. That's when I realized they weren't just gathered around the truck. While I'd been watching the activity, more people had spread out across the farm. A few seconds later, I saw one man slowly walking between the fences with an unlit flashlight in his hand, as though he didn't need light because he already knew exactly where he was going. That was the moment I understood the path back to the house had already been cut off. The only direction that still seemed open was deeper into the cattle pens. It wasn't a good option. There were wooden fences, muddy sections, and several cows resting nearby that could easily panic if I started running. Even so, staying where I was felt much worse. I crawled beneath a wire fence, trying to make as little noise as possible. My boots sank into the wet ground and I nearly lost my balance. The overpowering smell of manure and silage was so strong it burned my nose. I stopped for a few seconds behind the concrete water trough to listen. The voices remained low. Nobody sounded like they were arguing or desperately searching for someone. They sounded like people calmly carrying out a planned task. At one point I heard someone say, "Over here," followed once again by the sound of a heavy chain being dragged. Then I heard a metal gate slowly open and close. The cows started becoming restless. Several of them stood up at the same time and stared in the exact same direction. Anyone who's worked with cattle knows that's something you notice immediately. They usually detect movement long before people do. I stayed perfectly still, following their line of sight until I spotted two silhouettes slowly moving between the different cattle pens. I took a deep breath and decided to head toward the narrow passage leading to the storage shed, where we kept feed and tools. Inside was an old two-way radio that sometimes reached one of our neighbors whenever cell service failed. I knew it was a long shot, but it was the only idea I had. I stayed crouched until I reached the side door. It was slightly open, exactly as I'd left it earlier. I slipped inside and pulled it almost shut, leaving just enough space to conceal my position. The shed was pitch black and smelled of oil, old wood, and stored feed. I quietly felt my way across the workbench, searching for the radio. That's when I heard footsteps outside. They were slow, heavy footsteps crunching across the gravel directly in front of the door. The footsteps stopped. Absolute silence filled the air for several long seconds. Then someone grabbed the doorknob. It slowly turned downward without much force, as though whoever was outside was simply checking whether someone was inside. Every muscle in my body locked up. I held my breath and stared at the door, expecting it to swing open at any moment. The handle slowly returned to its normal position. The footsteps resumed and gradually faded away. I waited nearly a full minute before moving again, but by then I'd realized I had absolutely no idea how many men were scattered across the farm. I continued feeling around the workbench until I finally found the radio. I pressed the transmit button several times, calling for my neighbor, Hank, who lived across the main county road. All I heard was loud static. I switched channels, adjusted the antenna, and tried again, but nothing came through except interference. I clipped the radio onto my belt out of instinct, even though I knew it probably wouldn't do me any good. My phone was still in my pocket. When I looked at the screen, I saw only a single bar of service. I tried calling 911 anyway. The call wouldn't even connect. While I waited for the signal to improve, I heard another sound outside. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was the sound of a truck door slamming shut, followed almost immediately by someone whistling very softly. It didn't sound like someone trying to get attention. It sounded like a prearranged signal. A few seconds later, I heard two whistles answering from different parts of the property. That confirmed what I'd already suspected. There were several people working together. The strangest part was that nobody shouted, ran, or acted rushed. Everything happened in an organized, methodical way, as though they either knew the farm already or had studied the property before showing up. I decided I had to leave before they searched the shed. Behind it was a narrow opening in the fence leading into a larger pasture, and beyond that was the county road. It was a longer route, but it took me away from both the house and the barn. I cracked the back door open just a few inches and looked around. I didn't see anyone. I sprinted across the first stretch and jumped the wooden fence, cutting my hand when it slipped across a broken board. I kept moving in a crouch through the pasture until I heard behind me the unmistakable click of a flashlight turning on for the first time that night. The beam slowly swept across the fence I'd just crossed. A second flashlight appeared farther to the left, followed by a third. They weren't running. They simply advanced at a slow pace, scanning the ground as though they were searching for fresh footprints. That's when I realized that if I kept moving in a straight line across the open pasture, I'd eventually be spotted. So I changed direction and climbed into a nearly dry drainage ditch where the vegetation was taller and offered better cover. For the first time since everything had started, I felt like I might actually have a real chance of getting out without them finding me. The ditch ended near the fence bordering the county road. I was exhausted by then, my legs heavy from trudging through the mud, and my breathing sounded much louder than it probably was. Before climbing the embankment, I stopped to listen. The flashlight beams were still moving through the pasture, but now they were farther away. I took advantage of the moment and crawled beneath the final strand of wire, tearing the sleeve of my jacket on the fence. The instant I reached the road, my phone regained full service. I called 911 while walking as fast as I could without looking back. I told the dispatcher there were several people inside my property, and that I'd escaped through the back because I believed they had been trying to surround me. She instructed me to remain on the road and not return under any circumstances. About 15 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. I returned to the farm with them. When we entered the property, there wasn't anyone there anymore. The truck had disappeared. The only things left behind were deep tire tracks behind the barn, several footprints scattered throughout the mud, and a heavy chain lying near one of the gates. None of the animals had been taken, no doors had been forced open, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. The investigators spent most of the night photographing the tracks and asking questions. They also discovered that the padlock on one of the side gates had been cut with a hydraulic tool, something I hadn't even noticed while I was escaping. They never found the truck or identified the people who had been there that night. One of the deputies mentioned that in the previous months, several other farms in the area had reported strange activity during the early morning hours, always involving trucks that appeared and disappeared quickly. Nobody knew exactly what that group was trying to accomplish. Maybe they had been planning to steal equipment, rustle livestock, or were simply waiting for the right opportunity to act. I never got an answer. My parents came home the following day and we installed security cameras throughout the farm, replaced fences, upgraded the lighting, and changed every lock. Ever since then, whenever I have to make the final round alone after dark, I remember those unlit flashlights and the way those men quietly spread across the property without saying much at all. What still frightens me the most isn't imagining what they were doing behind the barn. It's realizing they noticed me long before I ever noticed them. Story 2. My name is Megan. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a large animal veterinarian in western Nebraska. My routine is almost entirely spent on the road. I spend most of the week driving from one farm to another, handling vaccinations, health inspections, calving assistance, and herd evaluations. Since many of these properties are far from any town, it's common to drive for hours without seeing another vehicle. At the time this happened, I was covering the area for a colleague who was on vacation. That meant visiting farms I'd never been to before. That day, I'd already completed 3 appointments, and the last one was at a cattle ranch nearly an hour from the nearest town. The couple who owned the ranch were very friendly, and everything went smoothly during the inspection. While I was finishing some paperwork, a powerful storm rolled in. The wind kicked up clouds of dust before the rain arrived, and within minutes the dirt roads were nearly impossible to drive on. The rancher insisted that I shouldn't try to leave that night. He explained that several sections of the road usually flooded during storms and said it would be much safer if I stayed in the guest room until morning. It sounded like sensible advice, so I accepted. After dinner, I sat talking with them for about an hour. The couple explained their daily routine and mentioned that they would be leaving before 5 the next morning to pick up a replacement part from another ranch, leaving only me and the employees who would arrive later that morning. Before going to bed, I made one last trip to the cattle pen because a pregnant cow was being monitored. Everything seemed quiet. The rain had eased considerably, but the wind was still blowing, and every so often I could hear the metal siding on the barns vibrating. The guest room was at the end of the hallway and had a window overlooking the feed and equipment storage buildings. Before turning off the light, I stood there for a few minutes looking outside. There were no lights in that part of the ranch, only a single pole light far away near the main cattle pen. The darkness was almost complete. I fell asleep quickly, but woke up sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of the dogs barking nonstop. It wasn't the usual barking that happened when a coyote wandered near the fence. They were all focused in the exact same direction, growling in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I got out of bed, walked to the window, and realized they were staring directly at the feed storage building. I watched for several minutes, expecting the dogs to calm down, but the opposite happened. They began circling around the building without getting too close to the door, as though something there made them uneasy. My first thought was that an animal had gotten trapped inside. I'd found raccoons, opossums, and even calves that had wandered into storage sheds looking for food before. I put on a jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and quietly stepped outside without waking the couple. The air was cold from the rain, and a light drizzle was still falling. Every step made a squishing sound in the muddy ground. As I approached the shed, the dogs backed away several yards but kept staring at the door. I called to them a few times, trying to get them to come closer to me, but none of them obeyed. When I shined my flashlight on the entrance, the door appeared to be closed exactly as it should have been. I turned the handle and realized it wasn't locked. That immediately struck me as odd because the rancher had mentioned over dinner that he always kept that building locked to prevent animals from tearing open the feed bags. Even so, I figured one of the workers might have forgotten to secure it before the storm. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit by the strong smell of corn, grain, and damp animal feed. My flashlight illuminated narrow aisles formed by stacks of feed bags piled nearly to the ceiling. I walked slowly, calling out in case an animal was hiding somewhere, but all I could hear was rainwater dripping from the metal roof. After a few yards, I found 3 feed bags completely ripped open on the floor. Feed was scattered over a large area, as though it had been violently pulled out. At first, I blamed rats, but as soon as I lowered my flashlight, I realized that didn't make any sense. In the mud that the rain had tracked into the building were several clear boot prints. They were large, fresh, and led toward the back of the storage building. I followed them until I reached a secondary door leading to the fenced rear section of the ranch. It was only pulled shut, not fully closed. When I pushed it open, I noticed the rear gate was also standing open a few inches. The padlock was still hanging from the chain, but it had been left unlocked. At that moment, I stopped thinking about animals. Someone had been there only a short time earlier. I stood there for several seconds trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to return to the house immediately and wake the owners. I had absolutely no reason to follow those footprints by myself. Even so, before leaving, I decided to shine my flashlight outside just to see where they led. The prints continued clearly through the mud, heading behind the storage building toward a wooden fence. I took a few cautious steps outside, constantly scanning the area. I didn't see anyone. The rain had almost stopped, and the only sound was the wind blowing between the grain silos. I followed the footprints for about 15 yards before realizing they curved and disappeared near a pile of farm equipment covered with tarps. I raised my flashlight toward that area, expecting to find someone hiding there, but nothing moved. That's when I heard a dull metallic sound behind me. It wasn't loud, it was the unmistakable sound of a heavy metal door slowly closing. I spun around immediately and saw the storage building door finishing its slow movement, as though someone had carefully pushed it shut. I ran back immediately. When I reached the entrance, I grabbed the handle and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder and realized something was holding the door shut from the outside. My heart immediately started racing. I pounded on the door and shouted, asking who was there, but nobody answered. The silence outside was worse than any response could have been. I kept throwing my weight against the door until I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. While I struggled to get out, I heard slow footsteps crunching across the gravel directly outside the building. They didn't move away. They didn't approach the door either. They simply paced back and forth at a steady rhythm, as though the person knew exactly that I was trapped inside and had no reason to rush. I gripped my flashlight so tightly that my hand began to ache. I looked around for another way out, but the windows were far too small for anyone to squeeze through. That was the moment I realized something that still bothers me today. Whoever had closed that door wasn't hiding from me. Quite the opposite. They had remained hidden the entire time, waiting for the exact moment I walked into the building so they could trap me inside. I took a deep breath and fought the urge to panic. The storage building had a workbench near one wall and a small office used to store paperwork and veterinary medications. I pulled out my phone to call the rancher, but there was no signal. I walked into the office hoping there might be a landline, but all I found was a desk, shelves, and a portable radio with a dead battery. While searching for anything useful, I kept hearing footsteps outside. Sometimes they disappeared for several seconds before returning somewhere else around the building. It sounded like whoever was out there was slowly circling the entire storage shed. At one point, I heard a soft knock against the metal wall, as though someone had tapped it once with their knuckles. A few moments later came another knock several yards away. That unnerved me even more because it showed that whoever was outside knew exactly where I was and wanted me to know they were still there. I grabbed a steel pry bar used to open feed barrels and positioned myself beside the back door, trying to control my breathing while thinking of a way out without going through the main entrance. The back door was much simpler, secured only by an interior latch. I slowly lifted the latch without making any noise and waited several seconds before pushing the door open. It moved only a few inches. I didn't see anyone. I kept opening it until I could squeeze through sideways, then crouched behind several stacked plastic crates. I stayed perfectly still for a few moments, listening. The footsteps continued on the opposite side of the storage building near the main entrance. Whoever was out there probably still believed I was trapped inside. I took advantage of that moment and ran toward the house as fast as I could. The instant I reached the porch, I started pounding on the door and shouting for the couple. The rancher appeared almost immediately carrying a shotgun, while his wife was already calling 911. We returned to the storage building together only a few minutes later, but there was no one there anymore. The front door was still secured from the outside with a chain looped through both door handles, something I hadn't been able to see from inside. The footprints were still visible in the mud, but they disappeared near the farm equipment covered with tarps. The deputies arrived about 20 minutes later, followed the tracks across part of the property, and found signs that someone had climbed over the rear fence. They never discovered who it was. One of the deputies mentioned that several isolated ranches in the area had recently reported similar break-ins, where criminals watched the property's routine before making their move. Ever since that night, I've never entered a storage building alone during a nighttime inspection, no matter how harmless the situation appears. Story 3. My name is Brandon. I'm 21 years old and I study agricultural engineering at a university in eastern Kansas. My parents own a medium-sized farm in rural Kansas, where we mainly grow corn and soybeans. Whenever I get a few days off during the semester, I go back home to help during the busiest times of the year, especially throughout the fall harvest. That's exactly what happened that week. The forecast called for rain over the next few days, so we were trying to get as much work done as possible before the ground became too wet for the machinery. We spent the entire day working. I drove one of the tractors for hours, and by the time we finished, it was already getting dark. We stored all the equipment in the machine shed, checked the locks, and had dinner completely exhausted. The farm was far from the main road, surrounded by large cornfields that were still tall in many areas that time of year. After midnight, the entire place usually became completely silent. It was exactly that silence that always made every sound seem much closer than it really was. I have no idea how long I'd been asleep when I woke up. At first, I thought I'd been dreaming, but I kept hearing the same deep, steady noise coming from outside. It took me a few seconds to recognize it. It was the sound of a diesel engine idling at low RPMs. I sat up in bed immediately. I'd known that sound since I was a kid. It sounded exactly like one of our tractors running. I looked at the time on my phone. It was 12:47 a.m. My first thought was that my dad had gotten up early to deal with some kind of problem, but that didn't make any sense. He would never work at that hour, especially not by himself. I got out of bed, walked over to my bedroom window and tried to make out something in the direction of the fields. The moon occasionally broke through the clouds, casting enough light to illuminate part of the crops. That's when I heard the engine rev slightly. It wasn't my imagination. There really was a tractor running. The strange part was that I couldn't see any headlights. I could only make out a dark shape moving slowly between the first rows of corn, as though someone was driving it in complete darkness. I grabbed the large flashlight my dad always kept near the kitchen door and slipped out through the back without waking anyone. My only intention was to figure out what was happening before making a big deal out of it. The air was cold and carried that familiar smell of dry soil mixed with leftover crop residue. As I walked toward the field, the engine became easier to hear. It wasn't a tractor working normally. The engine speed remained almost exactly the same the entire time, without changing the way it normally would whenever someone turned or shifted gears. I also found it strange that I couldn't hear any implement being pulled behind it. It was just the engine running while the vehicle moved forward slowly. When I reached the fence, I shined my flashlight into the field for a few seconds. The beam caught the side of one of our tractors. I recognized the paint immediately. It really was one of our machines. The problem was that it was moving with every light turned off, traveling in a perfectly straight line between the rows of corn. I couldn't see anyone inside the cab. The distance and darkness made it difficult, but it looked completely empty. I climbed through the fence and started walking toward the tractor, shouting to see if anyone would answer. I figured maybe one of our workers had come back to grab something, or perhaps my dad had quietly gone out without waking anyone in the house. Nobody answered. I kept walking, holding the flashlight on the cab. That's when something happened that made me stop instantly. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement several yards to my right. I swung the flashlight toward it, and for a split second, the beam landed on someone crouching between the rows of corn. The person was completely motionless, staring directly at me. I couldn't make out the face because the brim of a baseball cap cast a shadow over it, and they lowered their head the moment the light reached them. My first instinct was to believe it was another farm worker, but that didn't make any sense either. Instead of answering when I shouted, asking who they were, the person simply remained crouched among the corn without saying a single word. At that moment, I realized the tractor might never have been the real problem. While I'd been focused on the vehicle, someone had remained hidden, carefully watching every step I took toward the field. I didn't know where to look anymore. If I kept the flashlight pointed at the person hidden in the corn, I'd lose sight of the tractor. If I followed the tractor, I'd have no idea what the hidden person might do. I took 2 steps backward, trying to keep both within my field of vision, but it was impossible. The corn was tall enough to completely hide someone crouching down. I called out again, asking who was there. No response. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of leaves slowly being pushed aside. The person had started moving through the cornfield, keeping pace with my position without ever stepping into the open. I could only tell where they were because the rows of corn gently swayed as they passed through. At the same time, the tractor continued moving at the exact same speed, now a little farther away. That's when I started thinking the whole thing might have been planned. The sound of the engine had drawn me out of the house by myself and led me to that exact spot on the property while someone stayed hidden, waiting to see how I'd react. I decided it made no sense to stay there any longer. I turned my back on the field and started heading toward the fence, walking quickly without actually running. I didn't want to show panic. After several yards, I heard a loud crack behind me, like someone stepping on a dry branch. Instinctively, I looked back. The person was no longer where I'd seen them before. I swept my flashlight across the rows of corn, trying to find them again. That's when I noticed something else. The sound of the tractor had suddenly stopped. The silence was so abrupt that it made my chest tighten. Now I had no idea where the tractor was or where the hidden person had gone. Without thinking twice, I practically jumped over the fence and ran toward the house. As I ran, I had the distinct feeling I could hear fast footsteps moving through the cornfield alongside me, separated only by the fence and a few rows of corn. I never actually saw anyone, but the footsteps always stopped whenever I slowed down and started again the moment I picked up speed. I burst through the back door almost completely out of breath. My dad woke up the instant he heard me calling for him. I told him everything I'd seen while he pulled on his boots and grabbed a more powerful flashlight. My mom insisted we call 911 before going back outside, and that's exactly what we did. While we waited for the call to connect, my dad looked out the kitchen window toward the field and stood there silently for several seconds. When I walked over beside him, I could see the tractor sitting motionless in the middle of the cornfield. It was completely dark, exactly where the engine had stopped. A few minutes later, 2 neighbors arrived after my dad reached them over the radio, and only then did we head out toward the field together with the deputies who arrived shortly afterward. The cab really was empty. The key was still in the ignition, but the engine had been turned off. The deputies found fresh boot prints around the tractor along with multiple sets of footprints going in and out of the corn rows. The problem was that after several yards, the tracks disappeared where the ground became drier. The next day, we discovered something else that explained part of what had happened. The side door of the machine shed where we stored our equipment showed obvious signs of forced entry, even though nothing had been stolen. One of the deputies believed someone had entered the property intending to steal machinery. and had started the tractor simply to lure someone away from the house while another person observed the family's reaction. They never identified who they were or why they abandoned their plan before carrying it out. After that night, we installed security cameras at every entrance to the farm, along with motion sensors and automatic lights near all of the equipment buildings. I still help my parents during harvest whenever I come home from college, but there's one habit I've never lost. Whenever I hear an engine running after everyone has already finished working for the day, I never go out alone to check anymore. I call my dad first, then the neighbors, and only then does someone head out to the field. I still think about that person hidden among the corn. The tractor was easy to see. What truly frightened me was realizing that while I was watching it, someone else was watching my every move without making a single sound. Story 4. My name is John. I'm 38 years old, and my wife Claire is 35. We run a cattle ranch in western Oklahoma, where we've lived for nearly 8 years. The property has belonged to her family for a long time, and ever since my father-in-law retired, we've been managing almost everything on our own. Our days usually end late. Before going to bed, we always make one last trip around the ranch to check that all the gates are closed, make sure no cows are caught in the fences, and confirm that the water troughs are still working properly. It might sound excessive, but anyone who works with cattle knows that small problems during the night can turn into major losses by the next morning. That day, we'd spent hours repairing a fence that had been knocked down during a storm earlier that week. We were exhausted and just wanted to finish the inspection so we could head back to the house. The final stop on our nightly round was a water reservoir located at the southern edge of the property, nearly 3 miles from the ranch house. It was an extremely isolated spot, surrounded by pasture land and a few scattered trees. There weren't any houses nearby, and the only way to reach it was by using a private dirt road that began inside our own ranch. It was already past 11:30 p.m. when we drove there in our pickup truck. Claire was driving while I looked over some notes on my phone about the herd we'd be working with the next day. The sky was clear after several days of rain, and the only light came from the moon and our headlights. As we approached the reservoir, I noticed a dark shape near the fence. At first I assumed it was a piece of farm equipment left there, but as we got closer, I realized it was another pickup truck. Claire immediately slowed down. The vehicle was parked parallel to the fence with every light turned off. There were no headlights, no taillights, and no interior lights. We didn't see anyone nearby either. As we drove past it, illuminated only by our own headlights, I noticed something else that immediately gave me a bad feeling. The truck had no license plates, neither on the front nor the back. I stared at it for a few seconds, trying to remember whether any of our neighbors owned a similar vehicle, but I didn't recognize the model. The strangest part was that there was no outside access to that section of the ranch. For someone to park there, they would have had to come through one of our gates or cut through miles of fencing. Claire stopped our pickup about 30 yards from the reservoir, and we both sat there silently watching the other truck. My first thought was that someone might be having mechanical trouble. I even rolled down my window a little to call out, but there was no response whatsoever. No door opened and nobody appeared holding a flashlight. The entire place was completely silent. I got out with my flashlight and took a few cautious steps forward, but I stopped before getting too close. Something didn't feel right. The truck's windows were heavily tinted, so I couldn't tell whether anyone was inside. I also noticed that the hood didn't seem to be giving off any heat, the way it normally would if the engine had just been turned off. Claire rolled down her window and said we should leave immediately and call the county sheriff. I agreed without hesitation. There was no reason to investigate it ourselves in the middle of the night. I climbed back into our pickup as quickly as I could and told her to turn around so we could get out of there. Claire shifted into reverse and slowly maneuvered the truck on the narrow dirt road. When we finished turning around and pointed our headlights toward the way back, both of us froze. Less than 100 yards away, another pickup truck was parked sideways across the road. It was completely dark as well. No lights, no visible license plates. I'm absolutely certain it hadn't been there just a few minutes earlier when we'd driven through. We hadn't heard an engine, seen any headlights, or noticed any dust being kicked up. It had simply appeared, blocking the only way out. Claire looked at me without saying a word. Before either of us could react, I noticed movement in the pasture to our left. I pointed my flashlight in that direction. and for a brief moment the beam caught two people slowly walking through the tall grass. A second later, I spotted another silhouette emerging on the opposite side of the road. None of them carried flashlights. They simply moved forward at a slow pace, keeping some distance between one another, as though they already knew exactly where our truck would go. That's when I realized we weren't looking at an abandoned vehicle. That first pickup had been there to make us stop exactly where they wanted us. Claire didn't wait for me to say anything. She turned the wheel and drove off the main road, taking a narrow trail used only to move cattle into another pasture during dry seasons. It wasn't a route meant for pickup trucks traveling at speed. There were deep ruts, loose rocks, and stretches where the vegetation nearly closed over the path. The truck bounced violently, and I had to brace myself against the dashboard to keep from slamming my head into the window. I looked in the rearview mirror expecting to see headlights behind us, but all I saw was darkness. That made me even more nervous. If those people were really following us, why were they still keeping their lights off? A few seconds later, I heard something coming from the right side. It sounded like someone running through the pasture. I shined my flashlight toward the noise and briefly saw a silhouette moving quickly between two fences, keeping pace with part of our route. It disappeared almost immediately into the darkness. Claire asked if I'd seen someone. I simply told her to keep driving and not slow down. The farther we got from the blocked road, the more convinced I became that those people either knew the ranch extremely well or had studied the property before showing up. After crossing a particularly rough section, we reached an old cattle lane that was once used to move livestock toward the corrals. From there, we could already see the lights of the ranch house in the distance. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but the signal kept dropping because of the low-lying terrain. The call disconnected twice before finally going through. While I was trying to explain our location to the dispatcher, Claire slowed down because we had to stop and manually open a gate. I jumped out of the truck to unlatch it as quickly as I could. That's when I heard an engine start behind us. I turned around immediately. Far across the pasture, one of the pickup trucks had finally turned on its headlights. It wasn't following the main road. It was trying to reach the same cattle lane from another access point on the property. The moment Claire drove through, I slammed the gate shut behind us and climbed back into the truck while it was still moving. We both knew that gate wouldn't stop another vehicle for long, but it would at least buy us a few extra minutes to reach the house. The moment we caught sight of the ranch house, Claire pushed the truck as fast as she could. The porch lights grew closer with every second, and for the first time since everything had begun, I felt like we might actually make it out of the situation. I got back on the phone with 911 and managed to keep the call connected while explaining that there were at least 2 pickup trucks and several people inside our property. The dispatcher instructed us to stay inside the house and not go back out to investigate anything. As soon as we parked, we switched on every exterior floodlight and locked all the doors. I grabbed my shotgun just in case someone approached, but we stayed inside waiting for the deputies to arrive. About 20 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies and a state trooper reached the ranch. We returned to the reservoir together. Both pickup trucks had disappeared. The area looked completely empty, as though nobody had been there that night. Even so, the deputies found fresh tire tracks in 2 different locations on the property, along with numerous boot prints crossing the fence near the reservoir. They also discovered a section of fencing that had been cut and bent aside to allow vehicles through. The investigators never identified who those people were or why they had chosen our ranch. One of the deputies mentioned that, during the previous months, several ranchers in the area had reported groups entering rural properties during the night to observe the owners' routines and determine which ranches would be the easiest to target later. He couldn't say whether that had truly been their objective that night, but the explanation certainly made sense. After the incident, we installed security cameras at every entrance, motion sensors around the barns, and new locks on every gate. We also completely changed our routine. We never again made our final nightly inspection alone after dark, and we always let one of our neighbors know before heading into the more remote parts of the property. What has stayed with me the most wasn't finding that pickup truck without license plates beside the reservoir. It was realizing that while all of our attention was focused on it, another pickup had silently managed to block the only road out without us hearing a single thing. Even today, whenever I drive past that reservoir at night, I remember those people slowly walking through the pasture without flashlights and without saying a single word. Story 5. My name is Cole. I'm 31 years old, and I've worked on a grain farm in central Illinois ever since I graduated from high school. I don't own the property. I'm one of the employees responsible for the grain silos, the dryers, and storing the harvest during the busiest part of the season. At that time of year, it was common for us to work very long shifts because the corn had to be unloaded and stored before the forecasted rain arrived. That Friday, the entire crew worked until early evening, but one truck showed up late with the last load, and the manager asked if I could stay a little longer to finish everything. I agreed because there wasn't much work left. By around 9:30 p.m., all the other employees had already gone home, leaving me completely alone on the farm. The silo area was far from the main house and the equipment sheds. Once all the machinery had been shut down, the place became eerily quiet. The only constant sounds came from the crickets and, every now and then, the wind rattling against the metal walls of the structures. I'd worked there alone many times before, so I wasn't worried. I just wanted to finish and head home. It took me nearly another hour to wrap everything up. I checked the storage records, shut down the last pieces of equipment, and started locking up the silo access points. Before leaving, I made my usual inspection to make sure no hatch had been left open. That's when I noticed something that made no sense. A tall metal ladder was leaning against the side of the last silo in the row. I stared at it for several seconds because I was absolutely certain that I had put it away inside the equipment shed myself at the end of the afternoon. It was the only ladder that Tall used to access the top of the silos, and I clearly remembered securing it to the wall with the safety chain. At first I figured another employee must have come back and used it without telling me, but everyone had left quite a while earlier. I walked over to see if there was a problem with the hatch on top of the silo. Before I even touched the ladder, I heard a noise coming from above. Footsteps. They didn't sound like metal contracting as it cooled or the wind rattling loose parts. They were slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the metal catwalk that connected one silo to the next. I stood there trying to convince myself there had to be a simple explanation. I thought maybe one of the workers had returned to grab a tool and climbed up to check one of the grain gates before leaving. Even so, it seemed strange that nobody had called out to me. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the catwalk overhead. The structure consisted of narrow metal walkways with guardrails on both sides, but from the ground I could only see part of them. I didn't see anyone. I waited a few seconds, and then I heard the footsteps again. This time they came from the far side of the silo, as though someone was slowly walking around without making any effort to hide their presence. I shouted, asking who was up there. My voice echoed between the silos, but nobody answered. The silence that followed unsettled me even more. I kept staring at the catwalk, and for several moments everything remained perfectly still. That's when I decided to climb up. I figured I'd solve whatever it was in less than a minute and then leave. Looking back now, I think it would have been much smarter to get in my truck and call the manager or the police before putting a foot on that ladder. The climb was long and exhausting. The higher I went, the stronger the wind became, making the ladder vibrate slightly beneath me. When I reached the upper platform, I swept my flashlight across the entire walkway. Nobody was there. I walked slowly, checking behind the motors, the ventilation ducts, and the control boxes. The footsteps had stopped completely. After a short distance, I found a black backpack resting against the guardrail. I didn't recognize it, and I knew it didn't belong to any of the employees. Beside it sat a bottle of water that was still cold, 2 opened granola bars, and a package of sandwiches from a convenience store. One of the sandwiches had been eaten halfway and still looked fresh, as though someone had just been interrupted in the middle of their meal. I immediately felt a chill run through me. It meant someone really had been there only moments earlier. I grabbed the radio clipped to my belt to call the manager, but before I could press the transmit button, I heard a metallic sound directly below me. I looked over the guardrail and saw the ladder slowly moving away from the side of the silo. It didn't fall all at once. Someone was carefully pulling the base away inch by inch while staying completely outside my field of vision. My first instinct was to run back to where the ladder had been, but by the time I reached the edge of the platform, it had already been moved far enough that I couldn't safely reach it anymore. I pointed my flashlight toward the ground but didn't see anyone. The ladder was now lying on its side across the gravel several feet away from the base of the silo. I shouted, asking who was down there, and yelled that I was calling the police. There was no response. only the wind moving between the metal structures. I immediately pulled out my phone, but the signal in that part of the farm had always been terrible. I tried making a call twice, and both attempts dropped before they even connected. While I searched for a better signal, I heard another sound coming from directly beneath the platform. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing. Slow, heavy breathing coming from somewhere very close to the base of the silo. Instinctively, I switched off my flashlight for a second so I could pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Once everything went quiet again, I could clearly hear someone inhaling and exhaling directly below me. The person wasn't speaking, wasn't walking, and wasn't trying to climb up. They simply stood there breathing as though they knew I had no way down. I remained completely still without making the slightest sound for nearly a full minute. Then I switched the flashlight back on and slowly swept the beam around the base of the silo, passing over the equipment, the pipes, and the shadows cast by the massive structures. That's when I noticed a slight movement behind one of the concrete support pillars. I caught only part of a boot disappearing behind the pillar. Whoever it was had positioned themselves exactly where I couldn't get a full view. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear my own breathing. I grabbed the radio again, and this time I managed to reach the manager. All I said was that someone was in the silo area, my ladder had been removed, and I was trapped on top of the structure. He immediately replied that he was calling 911 and leaving his house right away. While I waited, I kept hearing small movements below me. Sometimes it was a single short step across the gravel. Other times it sounded like someone lightly tapping against the metal side of the silo. The worst part was knowing the person was still there just a few yards away while being completely unable to see them. The next 10 or 15 minutes felt much longer than they actually were. I stayed on the platform without taking my eyes off the base of the silo, moving my flashlight from one side of the structure to the next. At one point, I heard an engine somewhere in the distance. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I recognized the unmistakable sound of a pickup truck speeding down the farm's access road. Almost at the same time, the person hiding below me began to move. They didn't immediately run away. I heard quick footsteps crunching across the gravel, followed by the sound of someone weaving between the silos. I aimed my flashlight toward the movement and managed to illuminate only part of a dark jacket disappearing behind the grain dryer. A few seconds later, I heard a vehicle engine start. The headlights never came on. The sound quickly faded away along a side road used by grain trucks during harvest season. When my manager arrived with 2 county deputies, they repositioned the ladder, and I was finally able to climb down. My legs were shaking so badly that I had to lean against my truck to keep from collapsing. The deputies searched the entire area and found only the backpack I'd seen on the platform. Inside were clothes, a flashlight, work gloves, food, and several ordinary tools, but nothing that could identify its owner. They also found fresh tire tracks near a service gate that normally remained locked at night. They never discovered who that person was or why they had been hiding around the silos after everyone else had gone home. One of the investigators mentioned that groups involved in stealing grain, fuel, and farm equipment sometimes watched rural properties for hours before making their move, waiting until only a single employee remained on site. Maybe that was exactly what had been happening. Or maybe I'd interrupted an entirely different plan without ever realizing it. Ever since that night, there's been a rule on the farm. Nobody closes up the silos alone after dark. There are always at least 2 people on site until the end of the shift. And every time I see a ladder leaning against a silo where it shouldn't be, the first thing I do isn't climb it. It's call someone and wait for help to arrive. Story 6. My name is Hannah. I'm 24 years old and I live in a small town in southern Missouri. My aunt and uncle own a cattle farm about 40 minutes from my house, and every now and then I'm responsible for looking after the place when they need to travel. I grew up spending my vacations there, so I know practically every fence, every pasture, and every dirt road on the property. That weekend, they had left before sunrise to attend a livestock auction in another town and weren't expected back until the following day. My only responsibilities were to feed the horses, check on the cattle, and make one final round before going to bed to make sure all the gates were still closed. It was a simple routine I'd done many times before. The farm was large but very peaceful. The nearest neighbors lived more than a mile away, and after dark, almost nobody traveled along the county road that led to the main entrance. I spent the entire day without any problems. Late that afternoon, I finished feeding the animals and before it got completely dark, made my usual inspection. I clearly remember closing the main gate because it was heavy and had to be pushed hard to line up the padlock. I even checked it twice to make sure it had actually locked before heading back to the house. Afterward, I had dinner, watched a little television, and around 10:30 that night, I decided to make one last drive around the property before going to bed. I took my uncle's pickup truck and followed the ranch road toward the main entrance. The moment my headlights illuminated the gate, I felt an immediate knot in my stomach. Both metal gates were standing completely open, slowly swinging in the wind. For a few seconds, I thought my memory must have been failing me, but the longer I stared at them, the more certain I became that it was impossible. I remembered exactly what it had felt like locking that padlock just a few hours earlier. Someone had opened that gate after dark. I parked the pickup beside the entrance and got out carrying nothing but a flashlight. The county road was completely empty. There were no headlights in the distance and no sound of passing engines. The only thing I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees along the fence line. I walked over to the gate, trying to find a simple explanation. At first, I thought maybe the padlock hadn't been fastened properly and had somehow come loose on its own. But as soon as I looked closely, I realized that wasn't what had happened. The padlock was still locked. Someone had simply removed it from the chain and left it hanging from one of the gate's metal bars. I closed both sides of the gate again and secured the padlock through the proper link. Before walking back to the pickup, my flashlight beam swept across the damp ground near the entrance. There were fresh tire tracks leading into the property. They were sharply defined, with deep tread marks still impressed in the wet soil from the previous day's rain. The direction was unmistakable. A vehicle had come in from the county road and driven into the farm. There were no tracks leading back out. Whoever had entered was still somewhere inside. My heart immediately started pounding. I pulled out my phone to call my aunt and uncle, but the call dropped before it could connect. Cell service had always been unreliable in that part of the property. I climbed back into the pickup, planning to return to the house and call from there, where reception was much better. I drove slowly along the ranch road, watching both sides much more carefully than before. I'd probably gone about 500 yards when a bright glow suddenly appeared on top of a hill inside the property. I slammed on the brakes. They were headlights. A vehicle was parked up there, pointed directly toward the road I was driving on. It was too far away to identify the model, but I could clearly tell it wasn't moving. The headlights had just come on. I was absolutely certain because I'd looked in that direction only seconds earlier and there hadn't been any light. I stayed where I was, waiting for the vehicle to start coming down the hill or turn around and leave. Nothing happened. It simply remained there, illuminating part of the pasture as though someone was quietly watching me finish my nightly round. I stared at those headlights for several long seconds without knowing what to do. I considered turning around immediately, but to do that I'd have to make a tight maneuver on the narrow road, which would force me to lose sight of the vehicle for a few moments. I also thought about driving toward it to find out who was there, but I dismissed that idea almost instantly. I was completely alone, and it made no sense to approach someone who had entered the property without permission. As I kept watching, I noticed something that made me even more uncomfortable. The vehicle wasn't pointed toward the road by accident. It was positioned exactly where someone could see the entire route between the main gate and the house. Whoever was sitting there could follow every movement I made. I picked up my phone again, and this time I managed to connect to 911. While giving the dispatcher the location of the farm, I never took my eyes off those headlights. She instructed me not to leave the pickup and to return to the house only if I could do so without passing close to the other vehicle. That's when I remembered a narrow trail we used to move cattle between two pastures. It took a longer route, but it would let me reach the back of the house without going anywhere near the hill. I shifted into gear and turned onto the dirt trail, which was almost completely overgrown with tall grass. Branches scraped against the sides of the pickup, and the ground was extremely uneven. Even so, I preferred taking that route. Every few seconds, I checked the rearview mirror to see whether the headlights had started following me. At first, they remained exactly where they had been. Then, after about a minute, they disappeared completely. Not because they had been switched off, but because my truck had entered a lower section of the property, and the hill had disappeared behind a line of trees. That made me even more uneasy because I had no idea whether the vehicle was still parked there or had already started moving while hidden from my view. When I finally came out of the trail and reached the open field near the house, I looked back toward the hill. The headlights were gone. My stomach dropped instantly. I had no idea when they had left or where they had gone. The only thing I knew for certain was that, at some point while I was crossing the lower part of the property, that vehicle had stopped being where I could see it. As soon as I reached the house, I pulled into the garage, closed the door, and locked every entrance. I stayed on the phone with the 911 dispatcher while turning off the porch lights so I could see outside more clearly through the windows. She remained on the line the entire time, asking me to describe any movement I noticed. A few minutes later, I heard an engine running somewhere in the distance, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Then the headlights appeared again for only a few seconds, this time much farther away near the eastern fence line of the property. Moments later, they disappeared once more. About 15 minutes after that, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. I met them in front of the house, and together we drove around the property. When we returned to the main entrance, the tire tracks were still clearly visible. The deputies followed them for nearly a mile until they reached an elevated area near the hill where I'd seen the headlights. There they found several marks indicating that a vehicle had remained parked for quite some time, positioned directly toward the ranch road leading to the house. From there, the tracks continued toward a damaged section of fence at the back of the property, where the vehicle had apparently driven out across the pasture. The deputies never identified whoever had entered the farm that night. One of them mentioned that, over the previous several months, farmers throughout the area had reported people entering rural properties to observe the owner's routines, locate valuable equipment, and determine which farms were left unattended during certain periods. There was no proof that was exactly what had happened that night, but the explanation made sense to me. After my aunt and uncle returned home, they installed cameras at every entrance, motion-activated floodlights, and reinforced all the fences near the roads. They also changed an old habit. Nobody makes the nighttime inspection alone anymore. 2 people always go together, and they let one of the neighbors know before heading out. I still help my aunt and uncle whenever they travel, but ever since that night, I've never looked at that hill the same way again. What stayed with me wasn't the open gate or the tire tracks. It was the feeling of realizing that someone had chosen to remain perfectly still and completely silent, simply watching me finish my nightly round before deciding what to do next.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.